So this is topic 7.9, phylogeny. We're going to begin this presentation by a picture of the phylogenetic tree of life. And what this really shows us is how do we identify evolutionary relationship to one another. You can see in the phylogenetic tree of life, we all start off at the root of the tree. Through millions of years of evolution, species evolve independently of one another, resulting in the three domains of life: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. So what are the tools used to determine evolutionary relationships? Well, we discussed those in the last presentation, and those include fossil records, morphology, such as homologous structures, and then the molecular evidence, such as DNA and the amino acid sequence. So what this basically allows us to do is it allows us to take different species, such as I have shown here in the bottom left, the fish, the frog, the human, the duck, the cat, and the lizard, and what it does is it allows us to organize or arrange these species based upon our evolutionary relationship. So who is more closely related? And so we take this collection of species there on the left, and based upon these criteria, we are able to rearrange them in this phylogenetic tree shown on the right-hand side. So how do we do this? Well, to begin with, phylogenetic trees or cladograms show evolutionary relationships among lineages. On the right-hand side there, you see a phylogenetic tree. This is a branching diagram that shows the evolutionary history of a group of organisms. So you can see in this particular situation, we start with canines, which is our order, and we further divide it into our family, our genus, and species. So you can see how the various species here, the leopard, the badger, the otter, the coyote, and the gray wolf, how they are related to one another evolutionarily speaking. You can see that the coyote and the gray wolf share a more common recent ancestor. In other words, they are more distant related than the leopard is to them. When we look at phylogenetic trees, what we know is phylogenetic trees and cladograms both show the relationship between lineages, but the phylogenetic tree shows the amount of change over time calibrated by fossils or a molecular clock such as DNA or amino acid sequence. You can see this example right here. This is a phylogenetic tree, and you can see that the lengths of the branches represent how much genetic change has occurred between the different species. So in other words, the longer the branch, the more distant related those two species are. So if we look at this right here, Drosophila, or fruit fly there at the very top, is much more different than us or the mouse based upon the length of the branch. This is unique to a phylogenetic tree. So not only does the branch length represent genetic change, but they also represent change. So on phylogenetic trees, you may also see a legend of such, which allows us to determine how much evolutionary time has occurred between the changes we observe in the tree. So on the bottom of this phylogenetic tree, you see the notes of the millions of years. So going 100, 200, 300, 400, up to 500 million years ago. So the difference between a phylogenetic tree and a cladogram, well, a cladogram is a diagram that groups items based upon a number of common characteristics. So you can see in this cladogram right here that the length of the branches is not important, nor do you see a time scale. But what you do see here is that the species are separated based upon shared characteristics. And it is these shared characteristics that allow us to arrange the items in the tree that makes the most common sense. And we'll address that concept in the next couple of slides. So you can see in this particular example that the vertebrae column which is basically our spinal cord. The lancelet doesn't have that, whereas the lamprey, the tuna, the salamander, the turtle, and the leopard all have a backbone. So that backbone is unique to all those species with the exception of lancelet. And we work our way up, 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 going from jaw to forelegs to amniotic egg, all the way up to hair. Hair is unique to the leopard. So what is the anatomy of a phylogenetic tree or a cladogram? Well, a few terms we need to focus on here is the branch point. The branch point is the point at which those two species, so for example, species C and D, share a most common recent ancestor. So it is at that point, or that branch point, which that species evolved into the two separate species that we see today. As I said earlier, we start with the branches. So the branches represent evolutionary time. Ancestors are always at the root of the tree, and the present day species are at the tips of the branches. As you can see there at the bottom, the branch point represents a divergent event, or a splitting apart of a single group into two descendant groups, or two species. And we'll address the concept of speciation at a later date. What you can see here on the right hand side is this concept of the most recent common ancestor. And basically what we do here is we start at the ends of the tree and we follow our way back. So if we look at species A and B and we work our way back to the point that those two branches intercept, or at that branch point, that right there is the most recent common ancestor of A and B. If we look at the most recent common ancestor of A, B, C, D, and E, we have to continue to work our way back and back and back almost to the very root of our tree. So a lot of the questions that you'll be asked is, what is the most recent common ancestor between species A and species B, or species B and species C, or whatever the question may ask. Once again, this is further confirmed in this example right here. You can see that species A and B share a more common recent ancestor. That is in contrast to species B and C. Notice that the most recent common ancestor between B and C is a much further branch point on the tree. So in other words, B and C are more distantly related than A and B are. And those are types of questions that they'll be asking you on your test questions. A little bit more of the anatomy of the phylogenetic tree. They can look lots of different ways. Here are three different examples of phylogenetic trees. One laying on its side, one rooted up, and then kind of the more fancy one there with the diagonal lines. All three represent the same relationship between species A, B, C, and D, and E. So get used to being able to see them in the different perspectives. The next concept is this idea of rotation around a branch. So this time we're looking at species W, X, Y, and Z. And what you'll notice is that those branch points there are not fixed points. In other words, they can rotate around freely amongst that branch point. So if you look on the box there, W, X, Y, and Z, and we compare that to the phylogenetic tree, W, Z, Y, and X, they are the same tree. The evolutionary relationship between those individuals are the same. The only thing that we've done is we've rotated those branches. So just be aware of that. In fact, all the different branches you see on this tree all represent the same evolutionary relationship. All we've done is we've rotated at the branch point. Some students get mixed up on that, so just be aware of that concept. So what is the idea behind constructing a tree? Well, we start in this concept. We start at the most recent common ancestor of A, B, C, D, and E. These are cladograms, just be aware of that. And so what we do is we look for a characteristic that is distinct among all members with the exception of one. So in this particular situation, species B, C, D, and E all have a fuzzy tail. However, species A does not. So that is why A is the first branch point on our. Next, we look at another characteristic. This characteristic is represented by big ears. Species C, D, and E all have the big ears, where species A and B lack the big ears. So once again, you can see how we are able to separate these species on our cladogram. We continue this process. This time, what we're looking at is whiskers. D and E both have whiskers, where A, B, and C lack whiskers. So you can see over evolutionary time how the different characteristics are able to evolve in the members of the different species. So what we are looking at in these cladograms is really the evolutionary history of this species, and each one of those branch points represent a divergent point at which the species have evolved independently of one another. So the traits that are either gained or lost during evolution can be used to construct the phylogenetic trees in cladograms. In other words, shared characteristics are present in more than one lineage, and that's really shown nicely in this diagram right here. So you can see how B, C, D, and E all have the fuzzy tail, as I explained earlier. Another way of building these phylogenetic trees would be using this table you can see in the diagram. So in this situation, we're looking at 5 different species: the lamprey, the antelope, the bald eagle, the alligator, and the sea bass. And then on the rows there, we have the different features such as lungs, jaws, feathers, gizzard, and fur. A 0 represents that the feature is lacking in that particular individual. A plus sign represents that it is present. So you can see that our lamprey lacks all these features. And so our lamprey is the first branch point in our cladogram that we are constructing. Next, what you can see here is the lungs. What you can see here is that the sea bass lacks the lungs. The sea bass had a jaw, but it lacks a lung, where the other 3 species all have lungs. Next, what you can see here is that our antelope lacks a gizzard, where the bald eagle and alligator both have the gizzard. So the antelope is the next species that have evolved independently of the bald eagle and the alligator. And you can see how we just finish off the phylogenetic tree accordingly, where the bald eagle and the alligator are separated, where the bald eagle has feathers and the alligator lacks the feathers. Traits that are either gained or lost during evolution can be used to construct the phylogenetic trees and cladograms. These shared derived characteristics indicate a common ancestry that are informative for the construction of phylogenetic trees and cladograms. And so we need to look at these characteristics such as fur, gizzard, feathers, whatever it be, and that allows us to build these phylogenetic trees as we had just shown you. The next thing is that the outgroup. So the outgroup is represented as a lineage that is least closely related to the remaining organisms in the phylogenetic tree or cladogram. So you can see in my diagram right here, we have the outgroup represented by the letter A. B, C, and D are considered to be the in-group. So A lacks the characteristics, traits that B, C, and D all share. The outgroup in our example was the lamprey. The lamprey doesn't share any of the common characteristics that the other 4 organisms do. So be careful of the word